Sister love and support is all I need.
Honey, you've got that. You've got that.
If this conversation is in any way indicative of Chris's upbringing, it's easy to understand why he showed signs of deceptive behavior early on, which he euphemizes as having a crazy imagination.
I mean, I've always had a really crazy imagination. So like when I was a kid, like I even convinced my teacher I went to Japan over the summer or to China or something.
Why did you convince your teacher you had gone to another country?
It was just like what you did over the summer. And I was like, oh, I went to China. You're still right. She actually believed it. I was really convincing.
So you're a smart dude.
Yeah. It was, and they parent-teacher conference said, so how's China? What? Nope.
Deceptive behavior in small things can lead to deceptive behavior in large things, and it takes a lot of self-deception, not to mention pride, for a person to think they can get away with a heinous crime like this, especially when they don't know how to express emotions, let alone appropriate emotions.
Like when I got home yesterday, it was like a ghost town. Like she wasn't here, kids weren't here. I have no idea like where they went. And it's just earth shattering. I don't feel like this is even real right now. It's like a nightmare that I just can't wake up from. If she's vanished, like I want her back so bad. I want those kids back so bad.
Where'd you get that shirt?
Oh, this is, I think she got it off Amazon, but this is my favorite college sports team. I like these shirts a lot.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of good letters from people, just like people of support. So.
Oh, honey, you don't know how much support you had out here. So many people supported you. So many still support you. And
support him in what exactly? He's the one who's decided to plead guilty. Chris mentions the things that portray him in a positive light and leaves out the rest, most likely knowing that his mother will echo his claims.
But this is what you want?
Yeah, this is my decision. This is what I'm gonna do. Now this nightmare has to be over for everybody.
No. You have to remember, we're strong.
I know. This is my decision, though.
But don't ever confess to something you didn't do.
I know, but this is my decision, though. This is all me, okay? I was not pressured into anything. This is my decision.
Okay.
Cindy doesn't consider her son's guilt for one moment, even though no innocent person would ever plead guilty to a crime like this.
But this is what you want? But don't ever confess to something you didn't do.
And the statement,
you have to remember, we're strong,
speaks to Cindy's image of her family, an image which isn't necessarily true. Chris is obviously careful with not saying too much. Instead of saying he's guilty, he makes his decision sound like an act of charity.
Now this nightmare has to be over for everybody.
They keep talking as if nothing's happened.
I've been the service on Sunday. Oh my gosh, it was so pretty. Everything was decorated so nicely for Halloween, and we had crosses made for each of them. And I had bought a CD player at Walmart, and and they put the CD in, and it kept skipping, and it kept skipping, and kept skipping. And so they sang the song without the CD. And then the second CD they put in, it was skipping and skipping and skipping. And Monica said, okay, that's little Cece. She is over there messing with that CD right this minute. And then an eagle flew over the gravesite. And
really?
Yeah, and it was, and the pictures that we took, they were, they had a ray of sunshine in each picture of all of them, and it was a nice service. Everyone attended.
This excerpt shows the illusion of fairy tale that Cindy consistently prefers over reality. CDs often skip for no reason, birds fly over gravesites, and if it's a sunny day, there'll be a ray of sunshine in each picture. To say that these events are in any way proof of the presence of her granddaughters is the same kind of wishful thinking as when she goes on to say that Chris is the kindest person there ever was. One question to debunk this common illusion: what about all the other times, all the other services, for example, when there aren't any so-called signs, when there's no meaning? Chris laughs as the reminiscing father, as if he didn't take the lives of the girls Cindy's referring to, as if he's not the reason why Cindy has to make up signs that fit her fairy tale, as opposed to realizing the ugly truth about Chris's nature. And the illusion continues, with Cindy desperately trying to find meaning in the meaningless.
Your story's not over. It's just another beginning of something else, Chris. But your story does not end here. It doesn't end here. You are made for something else. Then I don't know what it is yet, but you are someone that I always felt that you had a pure heart, a good soul. No one could ever say anything bad about you. You were the kindest person there ever was.
Cindy is trapped between reality and her fairy tale. To her, Chris's story can't be over, because that would mean there isn't any meaning to her pure-hearted son's circumstances. Chris's story is indeed over, but Cindy needs it to go on. In relation to this, her many repetitions are worth noting, reinforcing what she says.
That does not end here. It doesn't end here. You had a pure heart. A pure heart. No one, kindest.
These repetitions are like mantras, indicative of people who are trying to convince themselves of something, as opposed to actually being convinced.
You are made for something else, then. I don't know what it is yet, but...
She doesn't know what it is yet, but she knows he was made for something else. This speaks to the illusion of fairy tale. She needs a meaning, even if she has to make it up. Same as with the skipping CD and the eagle. When the truth is, no one with a pure heart and a good soul, as if that's even possible to have, would do what Chris has done and then lie and look happy about it.
I want her back so bad. I want those kids back so bad.
7 years after Chris Watts brutally murdered his wife and children, his mother still calls him the kindest person there ever was. How is it possible that a man who committed such an unimaginable crime could be seen through such loving eyes? This documentary reveals the reality behind Watts' manipulation, how, even from prison, he continues to control the narrative, using his family's affection as a shield to protect his image. Through intimate phone calls and emotional exchanges, we uncover the psychological tactics Watts used to maintain his innocence, even as the truth became undeniable. It's a story of denial, deception, and the dangerous power of manipulation, one that will make you question how far a mother's love can go in the face of unspeakable betrayal. Chris Watts sat in his small prison cell, far removed from the life he once knew. Yet, it wasn't the cold concrete walls or the sterile environment of the correctional facility that seemed to weigh on him. It was his silence. The decision to withhold, to choose his words carefully, became a tool he wielded expertly. In the days, weeks, and months following his arrest, Watts was faced with an immense shift in his reality. The once prominent figure, a family man, a husband, a father, was now stripped of everything. But as his family and the public tried to piece together the horrific events that led to the tragic deaths of his wife and 2 young daughters, Watts remained composed, offering little more than carefully chosen words during his prison calls. In his initial conversations with family members, friends, and even investigators, Watts's silence stood as a wall. He spoke to his mother, his father, and others, yet somehow, nothing was ever truly said. In those early days, every word he spoke seemed deliberately constructed, avoiding the glaring truth. The murders, his actions, were reduced to vague, distant fragments of the reality that had shaken the world. He avoided specifics, never fully acknowledging the severity of what he had done, and the public's perception of him began to take shape based on what he chose not to say. In one of his earliest phone calls to his mother, Watts was asked about his role in the deaths of Sean, Bella, and Celeste. The question hung heavy in the air, but instead of confronting the dark truth, he sidestepped it, speaking in disjointed phrases, telling her that he wasn't ready to speak about it. He repeated phrases like, "I can't explain it all right now," or "I just don't want to talk about that," giving little insight into his motives or actions. His refusal to delve deeper into the facts left a vacuum, a space where uncertainty grew and allowed for continued manipulation. Watts' controlled speech was a careful strategy, one designed not only to keep his image intact but also to manipulate the emotional responses of those who still believed in his innocence. Each time he withheld information, his family, particularly his mother, clung to the hope that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. For them, his silence was a sign of reluctance to fully expose the horrors he had committed, not an indication of guilt. They continued to express disbelief, holding on to the notion that he was not capable of such brutality. And Watts? He allowed them to maintain that belief, feeding into their emotional responses. This strategic withholding was not just about avoiding confession. It was about shaping the narrative, one phone call at a time. His reluctance to speak about the murders fueled the public's speculation, sparking a wave of rumors, theories, and assumptions. Each time Watts said nothing, his audience, both inside and outside of the prison walls, was left to fill in the gaps. In the absence of truth, his silence became his first form of defense. It allowed him to remain in control, dictating the pace at which the truth would be revealed, or not revealed. The psychological weight of this silence was profound. In withholding the truth, Watts controlled the timeline of the investigation, the perception of his guilt, and his own public image. The longer he chose silence, the more it weighed on the investigation and the families involved. He created a sense of uncertainty, leaving law enforcement, family members, and the public hanging in a state of disbelief, all while he remained calm and collected. In these first phone calls, the audience begins to see a man who is not as remorseful or repentant as the world might have hoped. Instead, Watts manipulates the narrative from behind bars, using silence as his weapon. His controlled speech is not born from a place of fear or regret but from a place of power and manipulation. He is calculating every word, every pause, and every refusal to answer in a way that shields him from full accountability. The impact on those around him, especially his family, is staggering. As the calls unfold, it becomes evident that Watts is not only preserving his version of events but also reinforcing the idea that he remains innocent in the eyes of those who care about him. His silence, in this case, was not a sign of guilt, it was an act of control, a masterful maneuver to keep his family in a state of denial, unwilling to confront the full extent of his crimes. The psychological tactics used by Watts during these early phone conversations set the stage for everything that follows. His silence was not just an avoidance of the truth, it was a calculated manipulation that would reverberate through the rest of his time in prison. Each conversation, each carefully crafted moment of withholding, was a testament to his ability to control the situation, even from behind bars. And as the calls continued, it became increasingly clear, Watts understood the power of silence far more than the power of confession. His silence wasn't weakness. It was his most powerful tool. As the investigation progressed and more details emerged, Watts would eventually be forced to confront the truth. But for now, in these early days of imprisonment, silence was the key to controlling the narrative, and Watts knew how to wield it. With each phone call, he continued to manipulate, to withhold, and to control the story, his story, while the world was left waiting for him to speak the truth. Thank you for your incredible support. Red Heart. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. In the cold, sterile confines of his prison cell, Chris Watts' conversations with his mother became a delicate dance of emotional manipulation and denial. Despite the undeniable truth of his horrific actions, Watts' mother continued to shield him with unwavering belief, enabling him to control the narrative of his life. Their conversations, often tender but deeply manipulative, were the cornerstone of his emotional leverage, allowing him to manipulate not only the story he told the world but also the perception held by those who once loved him most. One of the most telling moments came in a conversation between mother and son, years after Chris had confessed to murdering his wife and 2 daughters. It was a phone call in which his mother, still firmly entrenched in her denial, expressed praise that would forever haunt anyone who truly understood the gravity of Chris's actions. "You are the kindest person there ever was, Chris," she said, her voice soft and full of affection. In that moment, Watts absorbed the words, knowing they were more than just a mother's comforting words. They were a lifeline, reinforcing the very manipulation he had relied on to maintain his innocence in the eyes of his family. Chris, ever the master manipulator, allowed the compliment to settle in the conversation. He understood the power of this praise. It wasn't just about seeking approval, it was about perpetuating the facade he had carefully crafted. "Thanks, Mom," he replied, his voice calm and collected, as though the kindness she described was indeed reflective of his character. "I try my best, you know. I never meant for any of this to happen." In this exchange, Watts carefully avoided the deeper emotional truths that could have threatened the version of himself he was still trying to protect. He never took full responsibility for the murders. Instead, he minimized his actions, framing them as a tragic mistake, something that happened outside of his control. His mother's praise, "the kindest person there ever was," became an emotional weapon in his arsenal. By accepting the compliment without correction, Watts reinforced the idea that he was still the loving son she had known before the murders, a man capable of kindness, not violence. This manipulation of his mother was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern Watts established in his prison calls. He knew that the emotional bond with his mother was his strongest tool, and so he wielded it strategically. Her refusal to confront the reality of his crimes allowed him to maintain his narrative. Every phone call was an opportunity for Watts to position himself as the victim of a broken system, never fully confronting the responsibility for the devastation he caused. The psychological toll on Watts' mother was immense, and yet, it was Watts himself who remained in control. His ability to manipulate her emotions left her unable to see the man behind the carefully constructed persona. She clung to the belief that her son was incapable of such brutality, and Watts used this to his advantage, feeding her the comforting illusion that he was not the murderer of his wife and children, but simply a man trapped in a tragic situation. The impact of these conversations was profound. Each time Chris Watts' mother praised him, she reinforced his manipulation. He skillfully avoided any real discussion of the murders, focusing instead on his emotional suffering, which kept the attention on him, not his actions. It was a psychological mechanism that allowed him to continue shaping his own story, even while incarcerated. The more his mother praised him, the more Watts solidified his grip on the narrative, ensuring that his identity remained intact in the eyes of those who still loved him. In the end, these conversations revealed the depth of Chris Watts' psychological control over his family. His mother's praise, although heartfelt, was a tool in his ongoing manipulation. She was not only unable to confront the truth but was also unknowingly feeding into the emotional leverage that kept Watts' false narrative alive. As he sat behind bars, far removed from the family he had destroyed, he continued to manipulate, control, and deceive, not through grand gestures, but through the subtle, powerful weapon of emotional manipulation. And in this dynamic, it was clear, Watts had mastered the art of silence and denial, and his mother's love was the perfect vessel through which he maintained his manipulation. In the months following the murders, Chris Watts' relationship with Nicole Kessinger, his former mistress, became another theater for his emotional manipulation. Even while behind bars, Watts continued to use his connection with Kessinger as a tool to manipulate, control, and craft the narrative of his actions. What began as an affair fueled by deception and secrecy would evolve into a complex web of emotional leverage, with Watts weaving lies to maintain control over Kessinger's perception of him and their relationship. Kessinger, having already been deeply involved in the emotional chaos surrounding Watts' family and the murders, remained a critical figure in his narrative even after his arrest. Their phone calls, conducted under the scrutiny of prison regulations, would often be characterized by Watts' deft manipulation, masking the gravity of his crimes while continuing to frame himself as a victim of circumstance. He repeatedly downplayed the severity of his actions, offering explanations and justifications that allowed Kessinger to hold on to the illusion of a future with him. "You know, I never wanted things to go down the way they did," Watts would say, his voice carrying just enough sorrow to seem sincere. His phrasing was always calculated, a deliberate attempt to minimize the horror of his crime. There was no admission of the premeditated nature of the murders, no deep remorse for the lives he had taken. Instead, Watts spoke in vague terms, positioning himself as someone who had made a tragic mistake, a mistake that, in his mind, was not entirely his fault. "I couldn't take it anymore, Nick," he said in one phone call, using a nickname he had once shared with Kessinger, the intimacy of the relationship still present in his words. "It was like I had no choice. Everything just piled up. I didn't think it would get to that point." These words, dripping with half-truths, were designed to keep Kessinger on his side, to maintain her emotional investment in him. He dismissed the fact that he had consciously planned and executed the murders, instead framing them as an impulsive reaction to overwhelming stress. His manipulative language worked to reframe the entire situation, not as a cold-blooded act of murder, but as a desperate, unfortunate event that spiraled beyond his control. Even as he spoke, Watts made a deliberate choice to speak about Shanann and the children in the most dismissive way possible. He referred to them as obstacles, burdens that had only added to his suffering. "You know, I never really wanted things to end that way, but I had to get out of that marriage," he would say, downplaying the gravity of the situation and placing the blame on his wife and the family he had murdered. "It wasn't about them, really, it was about me and what I needed." In these conversations, Watts expertly maintained a calm and controlled demeanor, never allowing his emotions to rise too much. His tone was level, unbroken, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than the gruesome actions he had taken. This deliberate emotional distance was yet another layer of manipulation, keeping Kessinger from fully confronting the horrors of his crime. His ability to control the tone and pace of these calls allowed him to stay firmly in control of how Kessinger viewed him, even after everything had happened. Watts' continued manipulation of Kessinger went beyond the mere telling of lies. He used their phone conversations as a way to reinforce his power over her, always positioning himself as the one in control, even when they were miles apart. His ability to maintain this power dynamic, even while incarcerated, showcased the extent of his psychological control over those closest to him. The affair that had begun in secrecy became a means by which Watts continued to dictate the terms of their relationship, even after the murder. Through these phone calls, Watts continued to make Kessinger feel responsible for his actions, or at least complicit in the version of the story he was telling. "I've been thinking about us, Nick. I really wanted to build something with you, but this whole thing just got in the way," he once said, using her own feelings of guilt and affection for him to further manipulate her. By framing their relationship as something that was still salvageable, he kept Kessinger invested in the fantasy he had created for them, a fantasy that ignored the grave consequences of his actions. His constant reassurances that he was misunderstood, that he had never meant to hurt anyone, only served to reinforce the control he had over Kessinger. The more he spoke, the more he ensured she would remain emotionally tied to him, confused by his lack of remorse and drawn in by his ability to emotionally manipulate. Even as the world around him began to close in, with the media coverage and the investigation into his crimes, Watts clung to the thread of his relationship with Kessinger. It was not about love, it was about control. The long-term psychological manipulation in these conversations was profound. Watts' continued ability to frame himself as the victim, to minimize the severity of his crimes, and to manipulate Kessinger's emotions highlighted the depth of his control over others. Even in the face of undeniable evidence, Watts was able to maintain his carefully constructed facade through his conversations, showing that his manipulation was not just confined to his actions in the world but extended far into his emotional connections. Through his phone calls with Kessinger, the true nature of Watts' psychological profile became clearer. He had used his affair as a tool for emotional leverage, ensuring that even after the murders, he could control the narrative of his life. His lies, his dismissive attitude toward the lives he had taken, and his continual effort to manipulate Kessinger kept him firmly in the driver's seat of their relationship. These calls, far from offering remorse or admission of guilt, were a continuation of the same patterns of deception and control that had governed his actions long before the murders took place. As the phone calls continued, Watts remained the puppet master, pulling the strings of those around him, even from behind bars. The manipulation of Kessinger, like his control over his mother, was part of a broader pattern that showed how far Watts would go to maintain his image, to protect himself from the truth, and to continue hiding behind the facade of a man who had been misunderstood, a victim in his own story. The more he spoke, the more he manipulated, twisting the reality of his actions into a narrative that suited his needs. In the end, these conversations revealed the true depth of Watts' manipulative nature. His continued lies about Shanann, his daughters, and the events that led to their deaths, all carefully disguised behind calm tones and emotional manipulation, proved that even after everything, he had not truly confronted the gravity of his actions. Instead, he continued to maintain control over those who still believed in him, even after the world had learned the horrific truth.
That's Chris Watts' mistress, Nicole Kessinger, blowing him kisses and professing her love for him.
I am having a wonderful time. You mean a lot to me. And I'm glad that you're having a blast. I am so out of breath.
The video, recorded just weeks before Watts murdered his wife and 2 daughters, was uncovered by Kyle Peltz, is the show's producer.
There's photos and videos of them on a secret trip to the Great Sand Dunes while Shanann and Chris's 2 baby girls were away on vacation.
There you go, baby.
That's Watts you hear behind the camera.
You're so damn sexy.
HLN also obtained voicemail messages Nicole Kessinger left for Watts. She giggles like a schoolgirl.
Hi. It's me. I miss your face. I was just calling to say hi.
Watts also took these provocative photos of his 30-year-old co-worker. He stored them in a hidden folder on his smartphone.
He hides this on an app called Secret Calculator. It looks and functions like a regular calculator, but when you enter 4 digits, it's a secret vault. It opens up and it reveals hidden photos and videos.
Watts claims he came clean about the affair to his pregnant wife Shanann the night he killed her and their daughters. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave and dumped his girls in silos of crude oil. The mistress told cops she had no idea he was planning to murder his family.
This shocked me just as much as I think it shocked the rest of the world.
Watts is serving.
The grief-stricken calls from Chris Watts to Shanann's family were not only an attempt to process the devastation that had occurred but a calculated manipulation designed to maintain the image of a grieving husband, helpless in the face of an inexplicable tragedy. His words were wrapped in a facade of sorrow, yet beneath that thin veneer, Watts worked tirelessly to keep the narrative under his control, shaping how Shanann's family, his in-laws, would perceive the events that had unfolded. These conversations were among the most insidious of his manipulations, where every word was chosen with the purpose of preserving his image, diverting suspicion away from him, and keeping the focus on the losses he was supposedly enduring. When Watts first spoke to Shanann's family after the murders, his voice carried the expected tone of grief. However, even in the midst of their pain, his refusal to take responsibility for the deaths of his wife and children was evident. "I don't know what happened, I just don't know where they went," Watts would say, denying the obvious truth in a way that felt rehearsed. Instead of acknowledging the horrifying reality, he was careful not to provide any concrete details, speaking in half-truths and deliberate vagueness. His version of the story remained intact. He was a man whose world had been shattered by an unimaginable act. Throughout these phone calls, Watts worked to distance himself from the event, focusing his narrative on the idea that Shanann's disappearance was a result of an external force, something that could be explained in a way that kept his hands clean. He never took responsibility for his actions or the lives he had taken. Instead, he would repeatedly say things like, "I just don't understand. She would never do this, she loved those kids." Watts' words were designed to disarm Shanann's family, who were desperate for answers but, at the time, unable to consider the truth. His consistent refusal to take responsibility was not just a defense mechanism, it was a carefully calculated tactic. By maintaining this narrative of confusion, he played on the family's hope that there had to be some other explanation for the horrific situation. Watts continued to present himself as a devastated spouse, unable to comprehend what had happened. "I just keep thinking they're going to walk through that door, or they're going to call me any minute. It's so hard to believe this is real," he would say, as though he were just as much a victim of fate as anyone else involved.
Right now it's you got K9 units, the sheriff's department. Everybody's like they're doing their best right now to figure out like if they can get a scent, see where they went. If they went on foot, they went in a car, or they went somewhere. And right now it's just like they've been on point. They're going through the house trying to get a scent, and hopefully they can pick something up to where it's going to lead to something.
What happened? Your wife came home. Tell me what's.
She came home from the airport 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here, and like about 12:10 in that afternoon, her friend Nicole showed up at the door. Like I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, say but she never got back to me. But she wasn't getting back to any of her people as well, and that's what really concerned a lot of people. Is like if she's not getting back to her, like if she doesn't get back to me, that's fine. Like she gets busy during the day, but she didn't get back to her people, which was very concerning. And Nicole called me when she was at the door, and that's when I came home. And then walked in the house, and nothing was vanished. Nothing was here. I mean, she wasn't here. The kids weren't here. Nobody was here.
What's your wife's name?
Shanann, Shanann.
What's your kids' name?
Bella and Celeste.
How do you spell Celeste?
Celeste.
How old are your daughters?
4. Bella's 4. Celeste is 3.
And so, how many times did you try calling her?
I called her 3 times, texted her about 3 times just to say, what's going on. Like because after I called her and texted her once, it's like maybe she was just busy. Like she had just gotten back. Like everybody's probably calling her from her trip. She just got back from Arizona, and I figured she was just busy. But when her friend showed up, that's what it was like. It registered. Like, all right, this isn't right.
Do you think she just took off? Do you think?
I mean, right now I don't even want to just like throw anything out there. Like, I hope that she's somewhere safe right now.
For Shanann's family, these calls created a sense of disbelief that lingered long after the truth began to surface. His calm, measured words did not match the brutality of the crime, and his ability to remain composed, despite the terrible circumstances, became a source of confusion and mistrust. The family struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the reality that was slowly unraveling. There was an emotional toll on Shanann's parents, in particular, as they grappled with the weight of their love for their daughter and their desire to understand what had happened. Watts preyed on their confusion, keeping them in a state of suspended disbelief. For them, it was hard to fathom that the son-in-law they had known, the man who had seemed so loving and devoted, could be responsible for the deaths of their beloved daughter and grandchildren. In each phone call, Watts cemented his image as a man grieving the loss of everything, while subtly deflecting suspicion away from himself. His version of events painted him as someone wronged by life, and, in some sense, by Shanann herself. He never mentioned his role in the murders, he never fully admitted to his actions. Instead, he cast blame on circumstances, on the stress, the emotional turmoil, the pressures he had been under. He positioned himself as the victim of a troubled marriage, a man pushed to the breaking point. The emotional manipulation was subtle yet effective. Each time Watts would reassure Shanann's family that he loved his children and his wife, his words would land like a soft blow, keeping them in a state of confusion and denial. His insistence that he had no idea where Shanann and the girls had gone, that he was equally mystified by their disappearance, placed the family in a state of emotional limbo. They were desperate to believe that the man they had welcomed into their family could not be the monster the world was beginning to suggest. As the calls continued, Watts tightened his grip on the narrative. He knew that his family's belief in his innocence would be critical in the days to come, as investigators worked to piece together the evidence and as public opinion began to shift. By manipulating these early conversations, he ensured that Shanann's family remained hesitant to fully embrace the truth. The more they heard him speak, the more they were swayed by his calm demeanor, the false hope that the answers might come from somewhere else, from someone else. But the impact on Shanann's family was undeniable. They were caught in a psychological tug-of-war, pulled between their loyalty to their daughter and the growing realization that the person they trusted most may have been responsible for her death. Watt's refusal to directly confront the enormity of his actions left them in an emotional state of paralysis, unable to process the depth of the betrayal. And Watts? He remained unyielding in his approach, manipulating every word to maintain his innocence and keep their focus on his grief, not his guilt. These phone calls, so seemingly simple on the surface, were part of a larger strategy that Watts employed to maintain control over his family's perception of him. It was an emotional tug-of-war, and Watts was playing for keeps, making sure that his role in this tragedy was always seen through the lens of an unfortunate, misunderstood man, never as the perpetrator of a brutal crime. The manipulation, even in the face of growing evidence, was masterful, deliberate and strategic, crafted not just to protect his own image but to keep his family from ever fully confronting the darkness of his actions. As Chris Watts settled into the reality of his prison sentence, the emotional and psychological toll of his actions began to surface in unexpected ways. The second confession was not the moment of full acceptance many had hoped for. It was a complex shift, marked by the subtle interplay of guilt, manipulation, and denial. Though Watts had already admitted to his crimes in a prior interrogation, the follow-up calls to investigators, family members, and others revealed the extent to which his psyche was still fractured, unable to fully reconcile his actions with any sense of true accountability. In these calls, Watts displayed a strange emotional duality. On one hand, there was an apparent recognition that his actions had led to tragic consequences. On the other, there was an undeniable effort to justify his decisions, deflecting blame, and even seeking sympathy. It was this contrast, guilt mixed with self-preservation, that would dominate his conversations in the months following his confession. While he no longer denied the murders, his way of speaking about them revealed a man still incapable of fully confronting the depths of his crime. During one phone call with an investigator, Watts' voice shifted from matter-of-fact to something approaching remorse, but it was quickly overshadowed by rationalizations. "I know what I did was wrong," he said quietly, the words coming more easily now than before. But then came the familiar justification, "But I was under so much stress, and I just couldn't think straight." His tone was softer than in his earlier calls, but it was still filled with the same excuses that had characterized his earlier denials. He wasn't truly taking ownership, he was framing his crime as a consequence of circumstances, a combination of marital struggles, financial pressures, and emotional breakdowns. This pattern of guilt interspersed with denial and justification was evident in nearly every conversation Watts had, whether it was with investigators or his family. In his calls with his parents, especially, he would occasionally soften his language, expressing a kind of guilt that was designed to elicit sympathy. I wasn't in my right mind. I can't believe what I did," he would say, offering these words as though they were a form of atonement. Yet, even as he spoke these words, he remained more focused on explaining why he had acted the way he did, rather than acknowledging the full weight of his actions. Watts' need for forgiveness was evident, particularly in his calls with his mother. He would express his desire to be forgiven, but it was not the kind of sincere, tearful plea one might expect from a man who had truly come to terms with his crime. Instead, there was still a sense of entitlement in his voice, as though he felt that, because he had confessed, he was owed redemption. "I'm sorry for what happened," he would say, but his apology was always followed by some form of justification. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to." This was where Watts' manipulation came into full view. He was not merely seeking forgiveness, he was trying to maintain control of the narrative. His apology, when it came, was an attempt to paint himself as a victim of overwhelming circumstances, rather than a cold-blooded murderer. He sought forgiveness from his family members not as a man who had genuinely confronted his actions, but as someone who believed that his sorrowful words could erase the horror of what he had done. The emotional shift in these conversations, especially when compared to his earlier denials, revealed a man who was slowly coming to terms with the reality of his situation, but only in a way that allowed him to preserve his self-image. Watts' conversations were peppered with attempts to manipulate those around him into seeing him as more than just the man who killed his wife and children. He framed himself as a broken man, damaged beyond recognition, and tried to elicit sympathy by playing on his family's emotions. What became clear through these interactions was that Watts was still deeply entrenched in his denial. While his language had softened, and he had admitted to the murders in a factual sense, he was far from taking full responsibility. His manipulation was not just about avoiding blame, it was about preserving his identity as a man who had been pushed into a tragic act, rather than the cold, calculated murderer he truly was. The inconsistencies in his admissions and justifications underscored a profound psychological disconnect, one where Watts couldn't fully grasp the enormity of his crime or confront the full scope of his actions. The impact of these conversations on those who were still emotionally invested in him, his parents, his extended family, was undeniable. For them, these calls were an attempt to make sense of a tragedy that defied explanation. But as Watts continued to manipulate his story, they were left in an emotional limbo, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of the crimes he had committed. Their desire for closure and answers was continually thwarted by Watts' refusal to fully confront the truth, leaving them trapped in a cycle of disbelief and uncertainty. Through these calls, the complexity of Watts' guilt and his ongoing manipulation was laid bare. He was not simply denying his actions, he was actively working to maintain control of how others saw him. He used his family's love, their desire for closure, to further protect his image and avoid full accountability. The contrast between his apparent remorse and his continued manipulation was striking, showing that, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Watts was still unwilling to fully confront the reality of his crimes. These phone conversations were not just confessions, they were part of a larger strategy. One in which Watts maintained control over how others perceived him, even in the most dire of circumstances. And as these calls continued, the true nature of his psychological state became clearer. Watts was a man caught between guilt and denial, unable or unwilling to face the full weight of what he had done, and using every word in his conversations as a means of continuing the manipulation that had shaped his life from the start. Even after his conviction, Chris Watts continued to exert control over those who were closest to him, using the same psychological manipulation tactics that had defined his behavior throughout the course of his life. Behind the walls of the prison, far from the world he once dominated, Watts still found ways to shape the narrative, manipulate emotions, and maintain the facade of a man who had been misunderstood. His final telephone conversations were not merely exchanges of words. They were calculated acts designed to maintain his image as a victim, to manipulate his family members into seeing him in a way that aligned with his narrative. When Watts spoke to his family, especially his mother, the emotional manipulation was almost palpable. There was no remorse in his words, no sincere admission of guilt. Instead, he continued to spin the story of a man trapped in a marriage that had gone terribly wrong, a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. In one of his final conversations, Watts said, "I just didn't know what else to do. I'm sorry for what happened, but I was under so much pressure. You don't know what it's like." The language was familiar, soft, victimized, and evasive. It wasn't an apology, it was an attempt to manipulate his family into continuing to see him as a tragic figure rather than a murderer. His use of emotional language was subtle, but its impact was clear. Watts manipulated those who still cared about him by evoking sympathy without truly acknowledging the horror of his actions. He painted himself as a man who had been overwhelmed, emotionally destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. "I never meant for it to go this far," he would say, his voice almost pleading for understanding. His words suggested that if only things had been different, if only Shannon hadn't pushed him so hard, then the tragedy could have been avoided. But this was not the reality. He had killed his wife and children, and yet, in his final calls, he could not take full responsibility for those actions. Chris Watts' manipulation was not limited to just his family. In his final conversations, even after being exposed for his crimes, Watts still attempted to maintain control over how he was perceived by others. He used his phone calls to reinforce his version of the story, to subtly control the emotions of those who were listening. He spoke with calculated calmness, never allowing his emotions to betray any real guilt or remorse. "I don't know what's going to happen to me," he would say, but the tone was not one of fear. It was more of an attempt to manipulate his listeners into feeling sorry for him. He framed his predicament as a consequence of forces beyond his control, including the media, the legal system, and his wife's alleged actions. The emotional blackmail in these conversations was chilling. Watts knew exactly how to use the love and compassion of his family to his advantage. He would often remind them of the good times they shared, of the man he used to be, subtly reinforcing the idea that they should forgive him, not for the murders, but for the man he had become due to circumstances. "I just want to be remembered as the good person I was," he would say, as though the terrible actions of that night could be undone with a few carefully chosen words. In his calls, Watts consistently reframed the narrative in ways that kept him in a position of emotional control. Even when talking about the murders, he would minimize their impact on his psyche. He would acknowledge the pain, but he would never truly confront the guilt. His approach was one of emotional detachment, never too emotional, never too raw, just enough to maintain the illusion of a man who was more misunderstood than monstrous. The disconnection from reality was evident, especially as he continued to downplay the tragedy. "It's hard to explain," he would say. "I've been dealing with a lot, and I just couldn't handle it anymore." Through these conversations, Watts continued to manipulate the people around him, forcing them to live in his constructed reality, where he was not the villain, but the victim. He needed to maintain his image as the wronged husband, the misunderstood man who had been pushed too far. In his mind, he wasn't a cold-blooded killer, he was someone who had been overwhelmed, who had made a tragic mistake. His ongoing manipulation of his family members, using his calm demeanor and self-pitying language, was an attempt to keep his image intact. This emotional manipulation wasn't just about getting forgiveness or sympathy, it was about control. Watts needed to feel as though he still had power, that he could influence the perceptions of those around him, even from behind bars. His ability to manipulate the emotions of his family, even after his conviction, showed the extent to which he still viewed himself as the one in control of the situation. Even though the evidence against him was irrefutable, Watts never truly admitted the full extent of his crime. Instead, he continued to manipulate his family and his own story, making them believe that the person they once knew was still there, trapped under the weight of circumstance, rather than acknowledging the monstrous reality of his actions. The psychological toll on those who received these calls was immense. Watts' family was not just grappling with the unimaginable loss of their loved ones, they were being emotionally manipulated into seeing the man who killed their daughter and grandchildren as someone worthy of sympathy, someone deserving of love. His manipulation created a lingering sense of confusion and disbelief. They could not fathom that the man on the other end of the line, so soft-spoken and regretful, was the same man who had brutally murdered their loved ones. These final conversations revealed the true extent of Watts' emotional detachment. His ability to manipulate those closest to him, even after everything had been exposed, was staggering. He continued to control the narrative of his life and his crimes, attempting to maintain a sense of power even from prison. The emotional blackmail he employed during these calls showed that Watts never truly took responsibility for his actions. Instead, he continued to play the role of the victim, the misunderstood man caught in a web of circumstance, never fully confronting the horrific reality of what he had done. Through these final calls, it became clear that Chris Watts was still operating within the same framework of denial and manipulation that had characterized his entire life. Even after the world had learned the truth, Watts continued to try and control how others saw him. The emotional manipulation, the detached language, and the constant reframing of his actions all served to protect his image and maintain his sense of control. Even in the final days of his sentence, Watts was still the one pulling the strings, manipulating those around him with the same tactics that had allowed him to evade full accountability for his crimes.
Watts will learn his fate for killing his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. Shanann, who is from
publicly, but his alleged mistress, Nicole Kessinger, tells the Denver Post she doesn't believe a word he's saying. He's